Ys 9 is a fantastic game, but one that is also a little bit of an oddball for the series. With its core combat being very iterative of Ys 8, Falcom opted to mix things up in other areas with a big focus on urban exploration over the typical jungles, forests and desert settings of the other Ys titles. And it does this exceptionally well with a relatively small open cityscape to explore by today's standards, but one that is seemingly entirely handcrafted with no reused similar assets to make up the environments, and is packed with all sorts of stuff to find in its various nooks and crannies, resulting in a condensed but also very compact form of the exploration akin to games like Infamous, Gravity Rush and Insomniac's Spider-Man, only mixed with Ys's staple arcadey action RPG combat. This open city environment on PS4, however, came at a great cost, as it was really pushing the limits of the engine that Falcom was using, causing an incredibly unstable frame rate. Areas outside of the city, like the roadways in the surrounding regions and the various dungeons underground, would run at a mostly solid 60 FPS, but exploring the city itself, which made up the bulk of the experience, would see frame rate jumps between 30 and 60 constantly, and oddly enough, the PS4 Pro actually made these problems even worse, despite it not actually having any boost to the game's rendering resolution. Luckily, thanks to backwards compatibility, the PS5 was able to brute force these issues for the most part, and improve the game's general playability by a significant margin. However, the story doesn't end there. While many PS4 games can be improved by the PS5's backcompat via brute forcing the issue with more power, the thing is this can only improve two things: locking unstable frame rates to their 30 or 60 FPS caps, and making dynamic resolutions, well, less dynamic. And it requires a developer-made patch to specifically take proper advantage of the PS5's hardware. And just a few months after the Western release of Ys 9, Falcom put out a patch for the game, making a few adjustments to better accommodate for the 60 FPS, as well as boosting the game's 1080p resolution on PS4 and PS4 Pro to a native 4K. Because of this, it's very understandable that when NIS America announced that there would be a PS5 port coming, that it would be an ultimately pointless endeavour, as the game is already patched and enhanced on PS5, and is also running at 4K 60, so there's no actual room for improvement. However, something to keep in mind is that even with a patch, a PS5 running a PS4 game never actually take full advantage of the system's hardware, which is why games like Jedi Fallen Order and Ghost of Tsushima got native ports on PS5 despite already having those optimization patches. And if you've seen my port report on Ys 8, you'd know that that game had a few more improvements than simply just a small resolution bump from 1800p to 4K, as stuff like the draw distance of tall grass and enemies was pushed all the way out to render everything and anything they could in each given area. And the thing is, Ys 9's open city of Bolduc has a lot of level of detail optimization with the draw distance and some very noticeable pop-in that could really be improved along with various other scalable options from the PC version. Luckily, Nisa were kind enough to send me a review code for the PS5 version, so much like my port report of Ys 8, we're going to be doing a little budget Digital Foundry for Weebs video here, where I'll try and break down the differences and improvements that this version has over the original. For starters, something that will make this a lot easier is that, like the PS5 port of Ys 8, this PS5 port is seemingly based off of the PH3 PC port that Nisa put out, judging by the size and positioning of the UI, meaning that I can very easily use that PC port to see which settings the PS5 version is being tweaked to. Starting off with the most obvious thing, the resolution, just like the patched PS4 version, is also a native 4K. However, it should be mentioned that the PS5 port's 4K is ever so slightly nicer than the patched PS4 version, and this is thanks to some simple anti-aliasing being applied to the image, helping reduce any noticeable jaggies from the screen. It isn't much, but it is a big improvement considering the very small performance cost, and it is nice to see here, as a lot of Japanese games on PS4 Pro and PS5 do tend to use the 4K as an excuse to not apply any anti-A, as if the higher resolution should eliminate the need for it. However, this has made certain games look slightly worse on their supposedly better versions. Either way, it means that the new PS5 port has a cleaner and less noisy image compared to the old version. And something that the PS5 does to double down on this is the improved anisotropic filtering. This may be something that's a little bit difficult to see between YouTube compression and my capture card capping out at 1440p, but thanks to the improved texture filtering, it means that textures in the distance and at an angle no longer shimmer like they used to on the old PS4 port. Something that wasn't too noticeable on the flat stone of Bolduc streets, but something that could be noticed in grassy areas like the surrounding regions and the city's farm. And once again, this does help clean up the image a little bit. Unfortunately, however, this is where the PS5 port's improvements seem to end, and we even start to get in a few areas where the game noticeably looks a little bit worse than the PS4 version. The game is a little bit darker in general compared to the PS4 port, which is admittedly a little bit of a sidestep depending on your preference. Personally, I'd say I prefer it, as going back to the PS4 version did make it feel a little bit washed out when I booted it up, and having that little bit more contrast and saturation to the game does mean that the special attacks from Adol and your various party members do stand out on these fairly dull and grey backgrounds, even more so than they originally did on the PS4 version. Something that I mentioned in my first impressions over a year ago, which I liked since it helped make the very grey colour palette a bit more interesting. But here it has a little bit of a knock-on effect with the shadows and the ambient occlusion, as the overall darker look of the game does make these two things more noticeable, and I do feel a little bit mixed on them. For starters, the screen-based ambient occlusion is present in the PS4 version of the game, but it's very hard to notice due to how blown and washed out everything looks, meaning it was kinda hard to see and a little bit too subtle, I found. However, on the PS5 version, with it being just that little bit darker, means that it's also just that little bit less subtle and easier to actually see. There is a higher grade of ambient occlusion in HBAO Plus on PC, however its performance cost is very high and I don't think it always fits the look of anime games very well. So the absence of this in the PS5 port is both understandable but also fairly welcome as well. The shadows, however, is another story. The shadows on the PC version of Ys 9 can be upgraded in two different ways. One by just the simple shadow resolution, but the other being the different types of shadow filtering that are available. Now, the highest shadowing filter on PC being PCSS is very expensive, as it blurs the shadows more the further away the shadow is being cast from the object casting it. So just like the HBAO Plus, it's very understandable why that option wasn't used. But I'm really confused as to why the shadows were not improved via either increasing their resolution ever so slightly or upgrading from the enhanced shadow filter to the soft shadow filter. Even just a little bit, since as the shadows currently stand, they're incredibly noisy and distracting, and with the overall darker presentation meaning that the shadows stand out more, it means that the flickering and shimmering of them stands out more as well. And considering what they did with the anti-aliasing and the anisotropic filtering, it feels like this area was just kind of missed, as it's something that's far more noticeable than the two improvements that they did make. The aspect of the port that I'm really disappointed about, though, is the lack of any improvement to the game's draw distance. Something that has not only not been improved, but also made a little bit worse in some cases, even if said case is understandable, but I'll get to that. Something that I mentioned before is there is a lot of pop-in that occurs when running around Bolduc, and there's 4 whole options above the default that could have been used. I wasn't necessarily expecting the higher quality buildings from further away across the entire city, as that improvement is reserved for only the ultra and insane presets for the draw distance, and that is frankly asking too much. But just like the shadows, I'm very confused with how little this port has improved, why we can't at least see some sort of an upgrade here. And we even have a downgrade via the foliage density, or at least we do in the farm area with the wheat fields, as the draw distance on this wheat is seemingly toned down compared to the PS4 version. Now, as I said before, this does kind of make sense, as this little region of the city is kind of notorious for making the frame rate tank. When I was getting footage of the PC version, I was running around the city with a mostly locked 60, however, going down to this farm area and looking across the wheat field would make my frame rate tank to around about 40. One other thing that I kind of noticed about this port that is a bit of a downgrade is certain animations during cutscenes do seem to be a little bit bugged. At first, I did think it was because I was fast forwarding certain cutscenes and it was skipping over animations and causing a couple of minor problems. However, thanks to it being used in a bunch of trailers, this single shot of Hawk running towards Chatelard made me realize that, yeah, some of these animations seem to be slightly off in a few ways. They very occasionally judder around a little bit, and occasionally when transitioning from one animation to another will kind of awkwardly snap between the two. Now, this is obviously a bug and will likely get patched out of the PS5 version of the game, since the missing water effects in Ys 8 also got patched out around about a week and a half after I posted my video. So I really don't think that this will actually be much of a problem for very long. And hell, maybe the reduced foliage density or the shadows is actually a bug and that might get patched too. Either way, if there are any updates that do make some significant changes, I will add it to the description or a pinned comment below. So yeah, that's Ys 9 on PS5, a little bit of a disappointing port to be honest, especially compared to the one for Ys 8. My guess is that since there were still a few frame dips on the patched PS4 version of the game, especially when there was a lot going on screen, that Nisa decided that this port needed to play it safe and get that rock solid 60. Even if it came at the cost of a fairly boring, no-frills port of the game. And that's not necessarily the end of the world, it is probably just an excuse to try and sell the game to a new audience. However, if you are already a Falcom fan who's played Ys 9 before, I really can't see any reason to pick this up. One thing I have failed to mention is that the DLC does all come included with this version of the game, including the DLC that was only available from pre-ordering, but 3 extra costumes for the girls and a second colour swap for Adol is not exactly the biggest selling point in my opinion. So if you already own Ys 9, unlike Ys 8's PS5 port, I really can't see any reason why you'd want to double dip on this. If you've not already played Ys 9 however, and you're looking to play it on a PS5, then both this and the PS4 version are both fairly decent choices to go with. It really just comes down to whether you think the slight price difference of whatever it is in your region is worth the minor improvements and the DLC costumes. Or if you're just late to getting to Ys 9 but you're actually a big super fan, then you've got another opportunity to get the limited edition if you really want.